So I realized that we didn't become entrepreneurs and e-commerce entrepreneurs to dive into accounting. If you're like me, accounting's up there with probably the least favorable things I would ever want to do in business in general. But it's critically important, especially as the leader of your business, to have a deep understanding of the mechanics of the financials and how that plays into your success, your viability, and your planning for the future. So the purpose of this video is really just to understand the core financial benchmarks first of an Amazon-centric business, and then how to review your monthly financials and how that can play into your overall planning process and strategy. So a couple things to remember. First, cash efficiency is king, right? Working capital, or your ability to buy inventory and continue to grow, is probably the most fundamental financial metric that you need to think through and care about as an e-commerce entrepreneur. And the financial mechanics that lead into that cash flow success really matter. So you've got to understand all of the inputs that generate that cash output, and understanding whether you're up, down, whether you're hitting what you need to hit, and what that means for the months ahead. And then it's not how much you sell or your revenue numbers. I mean, that's nice to talk about what your top line revenue is, but ultimately it's about how much money spits out the bottom of your financial statement, how much cash flow and earnings you generate. Because that's really what's going to enable you to buy inventory, grow, invest in people, and everything else to grow your business. So for me, the key goals of a monthly financial review is really just to monitor the performance, the macro performance of your overall business. This involves looking at trends primarily. So how are you looking year over year? How are you looking month over month? What's your year-to-date numbers looking like? What's your quarter-to-date numbers? That trend analysis, which again we looked at in earlier videos on a daily, weekly, monthly basis on how we kind of pan that down at the SKU level, but looking for those same trends at the macro financial level of your business are incredibly important. One of the other key things on a monthly performance review of the financials is really to spot the bleeds. Oftentimes when you're in the trenches day to day, spending money on ads, maybe you've kind of brought on some employees or you've got software and all these other things going on, you don't really see the macro impact of what all of those incremental business decisions are. But when you look at the monthly financials, it's black and white. You can see exactly where your OPEX is, you can see exactly where your revenue is, and importantly, exactly where your earnings are. And if they don't meet expectations, this is an opportunity to really diagnose where those bleeds may happen in a business so you can course correct them in future months and quarters. The other thing I like to do here is just match the structural benchmarks. We'll get into what those are when we open up a spreadsheet, but I really kind of want to see, hey, for my business, what is my percentage of COGS, my percentage of ad spend, my net revenue? How does that compare to other benchmarks that we know exist within the Amazon space? And we'll get into those benchmarks. And then I also want to kind of focus on earnings. What's the earnings trajectory? Because that's really going to dictate how many new SKUs I can launch, whether I can go a little bit more aggressive with inventory, whether I can hire people, etc. And then the final thing that we do as part of this monthly process is really just to do what I like to call judgment calls, which is just evaluating those recurring expenses. What software have you been spending your money on? Do you still need it? Looking at one-off expenses and does it make sense? Really looking at our product COGS and are they going up, down in proportion to our revenue? Kind of diving in at the SKU level on those components. Looking at marketing spend is a big one, especially the advertising spend on Amazon pay-per-click, which is becoming an increasingly large portion of the overall investment for an Amazon business. And then just looking at this kind of kill or keep analysis at the SKU level. Like, hey, are we getting enough cash and financial performance at the SKU level to kill or keep either SKUs, software tools, etc. in a business? So let's hop over here to Xero, which is actually the accounting software that we personally use in our Amazon businesses. We use a company called MuseMinded to put this all together. So they basically go into the Amazon account and they have access to all our bank accounts, etc. And they will feed all of those line item details to create monthly financials. And all of it is kind of generated in the hub of Xero. I really rarely log in, to be honest. I mean, there's some things here you can see in the drop down. It's got all the various businesses in here. You could come in here to like the accounting and look at, say, the balance sheet of a particular business if you wanted to see kind of where it's at as an example. But typically we don't really work in this. I work more on the outputs on a monthly basis that come from MuseMinded. So coming over to this spreadsheet, I wanted to start off by just looking at some benchmarks for an Amazon business. This is something I actually got from MuseMinded, who has hundreds of clients. And so they look at median averages as well as kind of their elite clients. So we can start to understand what proportions of expenses and earnings and other things does a typical or median Amazon business have, and what does an elite business have. So I wanted to outline those here. On a monthly basis, we actually look at that in concert with how our own monthly performance is. So we can kind of see trend lines. Hey, are we behaving similar to other Amazon businesses? Are we below, or are we exceeding the performance of an average Amazon business? So if you look here, this is just what is your inventory cost as a percentage of your revenue. This is fees on Amazon as a percentage of revenue, gross profit, typical gross profit, how much is spent on people, how much is spent on growth or advertising, operational costs, travel, admin, other operating, etc. And then ultimately, what's the net income, or like the net EBITDA percentage earnings that a median and an elite Amazon business has. So that's really what these numbers are. To turn this into an example, let's just assume that you've got a business that did $100,000 a month, just to keep the math simple. In the median example, that means that there'd be about $31,000 spent on the COGS to sell that revenue, about $33,000 in Amazon expenses. Kind of coming down the line, you'd have a gross profit of about $32,000 versus $51,000 in the elite case. They're spending about $3,700 on people. These guys aren't really spending much on people, so they're really lean in terms of people per percentage. And then growth here, right? So about 10% tacos or marketing spend, whereas these guys are only 2.4% at $2,400. And then coming all the way down, basically what this is saying is that your median kind of down the middle Amazon business is basically going to generate $7,900 in earnings for every 100,000 in revenue, or 7.9%. Versus in the elite example, they're generating almost 24%. So they're about $24,000-ish on 100,000. So if you ever want to see how your business stacks up in these various categories, here's kind of a scratch math way, directional way to look at this, just to see where you may be going off. So let's say that your net income's way lower than this. You can start by running down this line and saying, hey, where am I off of where the median is? Are my COGS a lot more expensive, which means our margins aren't right? Are we spending too much on advertising? Are we spending too much on people and expenses? But I really like this barometer just to kind of get a sanity check for your Amazon business. Now, I pulled together also an example. I'll just reduce the size a little bit, of a actual income statement. So this is very close to a business, one of our businesses in 2020, just as an example. I changed these kind of numbers just so it's a little bit more up to date. But basically, how we get our monthly financials is we get it. You'll kind of think, hey, this is a little bit opposite. But the newest month we always keep in the left column, and then we can kind of reference the year to date on the far right. So it's the month of October now. So let's just say that I was looking at the month of October. This is kind of how we would get our monthly financials. So I'd see this month being October. I'd be able to see last month all the way through to year to date. But let's just pretend that we're looking at this as a holistic year, and maybe that we're looking at December's numbers and we're kind of trying to see how it looks. What I basically like to do is I like to first start off by, hey, what was our revenue? So it was 1.5 million. And then I like to kind of see, hey, how did that stack up versus previous months? If you've got a historical business that has multiple years, a really, really critical one too is looking at this December versus the previous year's December. So if we've got multiple years, I'd like to have that here as well, or maybe a column that just shows percentage change from a previous year. But I'm kind of like just looking generically, hey, how are we stacking up in terms of the overall performance? Is our return rate kind of higher or lower on a percentage basis? Kind of scanning down, if you've got kind of international sales, you can see those here. Website sales, I don't really care a whole lot about because it's not a core part of a lot of our Amazon-centric businesses. And then you can kind of see your total revenue down here, which kind of shows all the lines here. Then I would come down and look at inventory costs. A big thing that I'm looking at here is less so the dollar amount, and it's more so the percentage. So we want to keep our COGS kind of, again, going back to this benchmark. In the median case, we want to be below or at 31%. If we're super elite and have a crazy high margin business, we would be at about 20%. Us personally, I kind of want to see this below 30%, ideally, below 35 at a minimum. So I'm kind of looking at the percentage basis. Looking at the platform fees again, you want those to be sub 30% is kind of what we look to have. You look at your total cost of sales here, and then your gross profit. Again, the profit you want to be north of 40 is kind of how we look at a minimum north of 35%. Then coming down, this particular business didn't have a whole lot of people in it yet, but you want to keep your team pretty lean. You definitely want to be like less than 3%, I would say, in terms of OpEx. So you're really typically going to have OpEx lean businesses for an Amazon brand. And then coming down to growth, this is another really, really big component of spending. It's going to be even more as we've seen advertising costs go up. Typically and traditionally, you would have liked to have seen a tacos kind of less than 12%, ideally less than 10%. I think the new world order of Amazon businesses is probably going to be around 15%, just given how much ad costs have gone up and how much more a part of an Amazon strategy it's become. But you can kind of see here that in this particular business, I think this December, we actually were running out of stock, so we turned most of the ads off. So that was like incredibly low. But you can kind of see here generally throughout the year, we did a 9.5%, which is right about where you'd want to be. So you can kind of look at that on a month. Hey, am I spending more or less? This is a key driver for when you actually don't hit your earnings expectations. So if you've ever kind of not made the money that you wanted or lost money, it's typically going to be chalked up to advertising spend, honestly. That's kind of one of the biggest things that can get out of hand if you don't pay attention to it. And then there's facilities operations and admin stuff that's usually quite inexpensive. And then scrolling all the way down, the other thing that I really want to look at is like how much money do we make? So in this case, we did a net of 19%, which is solid. You can see for the year on this one was 13%, which is a little low. You typically want to see this number be 15% or above. I think that's kind of a healthy range for an Amazon business, especially if you're looking to exit. You kind of want to be north of 15%, unless you're really, really high volume and you've got, maybe you're just doing massive volume so you can afford to have lower net earnings. But I think for your average seller, you kind of want to be north of 15% on those earnings. So that's kind of how we look at monthly financials. It's a core part of what you need to do. Again, if you've got somebody compiling it, I definitely recommend using a bookkeeper. This stuff is a total pain in the butt to compile. And if you're not an accountant, you can oftentimes make mistakes. So doing this, number one, really sets you up to prepare your taxes. But I think it's also just good to get a digestible, kind of readable thing that you can spend, an hour on a month after you get your financials and be thinking about how did your business do? What does it mean for the months and years ahead?